She said it with one hand on the top rail and the last light of September running along the fence wire like a held breath. Men always leave me by sundown. The words came low, almost embarrassed by themselves, as though Clara Belle Mercer had meant to keep them in and had only failed by an inch. West of her, the San Juan peaks were going violet above the Animas Valley. East of her, the peach rows stood in tidy dark lines, their leaves beginning to bronze. Between those two pieces of land stood Elias Rowan Hale, hat in both hands, shoulders still from the long habit of listening before he spoke. He looked past her once, toward the upper bench where his pasture held light longer than anybody else's in that stretch above Durango, and then back at her. "I own the sun here," he said. He said it almost like a joke. Almost. But there was nothing playful in the way he stayed where he was, as if the whole evening had been deeded to one choice and he meant to sign his name to it. In the spring of 1888, Clara Belle Mercer was 29 years old, 5 years widowed, and the proprietor of 17 acres of peach trees and one weather-beaten packing shed on the east side of the county road 6 miles south of Durango, Colorado. Her husband, Daniel Mercer, had gone under with a wagon team in Lightner Creek during the runoff of April 1883, leaving her a narrow mortgage, a broad silence, and a piece of land too good to sell and too difficult to keep without becoming hard in the process. She lived in the whitewashed orchard house with her 17-year-old sister, Ruthie Mercer, 3 hens that laid when they pleased, 1 mule named Gideon who disliked strangers on principle, and a debt note of $312 due to First San Juan Mercantile Bank on October 1st. Men had in fact left Clara by sundown in so many forms that she no longer bothered naming the difference between death, duty, and cowardice. Her father had ridden freight to Santa Fe and failed to come home twice before he finally failed for good. Boarders came for a harvest week and moved on. Hired hands took supper, promised a return, and vanished behind their own excuses. That is what loneliness does. It trains the ear for departures. Elias Rowan Hale was 33, careful with his words, and owner of 240 acres on the west bench everybody around Junction Creek called Sun Bench because the ridge held light after the valley dimmed. He ran 73 head of cattle, 16 saddle horses, and a hay meadow that sloped toward Clara's far fence line. He had buried his younger brother Mateo after the blizzard of January 1885 and had grown quieter afterward in a way the town understood without discussing often. Deputy Tomas Vega called him steady. Adeline Pike said a storm could not embarrass him. Ruthie Mercer, who watched people the way other girls watched birds, said only that he never looked at Clara like he was measuring what trouble she might be. His Tuesday visits began as trade and became a ritual before either of them admitted it. On Tuesday afternoons he passed Clara's orchard road with whatever small necessities she had written on brown paper the week before. Coffee, salt, lamp wicks, blue thread, once even a lemon because Ruthie had been sick. He would leave the parcel on the porch, water his horse, and stay long enough to fix whatever was failing nearby. The first time he remained until the orchard rows had gone dark. Clara took the flour sack from his hands and muttered, half to herself, "Men always leave me by sundown." He glanced toward the west bench, where light still burned on his pasture, and answered, "I own the sun here." Ruthie laughed. Clara did not. But that night she found herself repeating his answer under her breath, as if testing whether a foolish sentence could keep a room warm. Spring laid itself across La Plata County in layers rather than all at once. Tuesdays collected themselves into a quiet pattern. Elias brought flour, nails, seed potatoes, and once peppermint drops for Ruthie that he claimed had been left over from a cattle buyer's order though nobody believed him. Clara gave him warm bread, peach preserves, or nothing at all if gratitude threatened to look like dependence. Around them, the town chorus found its voice. Adeline Pike said Clara's name in the thoughtful tone women used when they saw farther down a road than the person walking it. Tomas Vega remarked that men who repaired another person's irrigation sluice without being asked were rarely thinking only of water. Ruthie asked why Clara smoothed her hair before Tuesday suppers if the visits meant nothing. Clara answered by handing her another basin to wash. Some truths are easier to scrub at than speak. The first real test came on May 11th, 3 days after a night wind tore down from the mountains hard enough to strip half the new leaves from the south row and push silt into the lateral ditch that fed Clara's lower acres. By dawn the water had gone wrong, pooling near the road while the far trees stood thirsty in soil beginning to crust. Clara had one hired man that week, a boy from Mancos named Jeb, and by noon he had done enough worrying out loud to become less useful than the shovel. Elias arrived without announcement, saw the breach, and did not ask who was at fault. He dropped his coat on the fence, waded knee-deep into the chilled mud, and began cutting a new channel with the ruthless economy of someone who understood that water lost to talk does not return because of it. Clara worked beside him for the first hour, skirt pinned up under her apron, boots sinking, palms blistering. Jeb carried stones. Ruthie brought boiled coffee in a lard pail. By sunset Elias had reset the boards, packed the sides with gravel, and redirected enough current that the far roots drank before dark. He never said he had saved anything. He only rinsed his hands at the pump and asked Clara whether the east row had taken damage from the grit. Work can be a promise long before words catch up. After that, the orchard altered him in her eyes. Before then, he had been a decent man with reliable hands and a Tuesday route. Afterward, he was the person Clara looked for at the edge of any difficulty, which offended her pride almost as much as it relieved her heart. She tried for 2 weeks to behave as if nothing important had shifted. Still, she kept finding evidence of him where no evidence should have been. A wagon wheel that no longer listed, a latch that closed true, a washline post driven deeper because he had noticed it leaning. None of it announced itself. That was its force. Daniel Mercer had been a good man, but he had often meant to fix what he postponed. Elias fixed what he saw. The difference unsettled her because it felt like judgment delivered without a single accusing word. Nathaniel Greeley entered the matter the way practical concerns often do. Polished shoes first, sympathy second, calculation hidden beneath both. He was 36, assistant cashier at the bank, widowed 2 years, and regarded as a safe pair of hands for money or marriage. He began calling at the orchard in late May under the courteous pretense of reviewing the October note. On his 3rd visit, he said the bank preferred orderly arrangements to desperate ones. If Clara wished, he could speak on her behalf about extending the note in exchange for partial ownership of the West Field, perhaps more if a household were combined in the bargain. It was the kind of proposal a lonely woman was expected to thank God for. Clara thanked him for the warning. Nathaniel inclined his head and said October arrived fast for people who hoped instead of planned. June came green and windy. The river swelled with meltwater. Cottonwoods along the Animus turned their leaves over silver before storms and back to green after them, like hands changing their mind. Clara's days filled with the labor that kept feeling from becoming the loudest thing in a body. She rose before 5, checked for curl in the tender leaves, baked bread, mended sacks, wrote figures in the ledger, and tried not to note each absence with its exact shape. When Elias came on Tuesdays, she grew brisk. When he left, she grew silent. She began resenting Nathaniel not because he had done anything cruel, but because his offer stood in the yard like a measuring rod against which all her motives looked either foolish or proud. Adeline Pike solved nothing by saying the obvious. Security is a coat, she told Clara over tea at the hotel kitchen. But it is not always warmth. Tomas Vega, shoeing a gelding nearby, added that a person could spend a lifetime mistaking shelter for home if they were determined to be sensible. Ruthie, whose patience for adult caution had nearly expired, asked Clara whether she intended to marry a ledger. Clara answered that ledgers, at least, did not disappoint. Even as she said it, she knew the sentence was weak. Lies usually are. On the 2nd Tuesday of June, Elias arrived with a carpenter's level tucked through the back of his wagon and a square of clean glass wrapped in old flannel. Clara found him measuring the east wall of the kitchen before she had managed so much as a proper greeting. That window is crooked enough to bend morning, he said. She told him it had been crooked since 1879 and had not yet ruined the sun. He said maybe the sun deserved a fairer entrance. By dusk he had pulled the rotted trim, reset the frame, and fitted a new pane where the old one had held more putty than glass. He planed a narrow shelf beneath it from scrap pine and braced it with 2 small supports. For bread, he said when Clara stared at the finished work. Or seedlings if you've got the notion. The next morning the light came through clear and steady across her flower board, turning the dust in the air gold. Clara stood there longer than the oven required and thought, with irritation that bordered on grief, that no one had ever changed a wall in order to improve the way morning reached her hands. That is what love looks like before it calls itself love. It makes room for light. His route changed once in July, and the change mattered because routines in lonely lives behave like promises. Tuesday came and passed without his wagon on the orchard road. On Wednesday, Tomas Vega rode out to return a wrench and mentioned that Elias had been up all night with a mare foaling crosswise and then had ridden to Bayfield for a doctor for one of his hands. He had still sent the salt and lamp oil by stage, neatly covered against the dust. Not a Tuesday, Clara thought, and felt the humiliating relief of noticing. Late Thursday Elias came in himself, hat low and eyes tired. She offered coffee. He accepted. As he was leaving, she said lightly, "You do know men always leave me by sundown." He looked at the long summer light still standing on his west ridge and answered, "Not if they own the sun here." This time she laughed. Startled them both. July's peaches began to round. So did the town's certainty. Adeline Pike told Clara that half of Durango had begun wagering quietly on whether she would choose common sense or happiness. Nathaniel remained impeccable, bringing market news and quiet advantages from town. Elias brought usefulness in rougher forms. Repaired hinges, a bolted wagon tongue, cedar posts stacked beside the south pasture because he had seen hers rotting. Nathaniel's usefulness sat across from you and made its case. Elias's got under the weather and changed it. Clara understood why one kind of life looked safer. She also understood, with growing discomfort, that safety and desire had started walking in opposite directions inside her. The more central question in town was not whether Elias cared. Even Tomas Vega, who trusted actions more than claims, had concluded that much by midsummer. The question was why a man who could face down a blown ditch in the dark and argue cattle weights with railroad buyers without blinking turned so cautious whenever the matter in front of him was a woman smoothing flour from her wrists. Clara guessed at 3 or 4 reasons and was wrong about all of them until August. She suspected first that he still belonged partly to some woman elsewhere. Then that he judged her too wounded for a new household. Then, on meaner afternoons, that quiet kindness came easier to him than costly commitment. Elias offered nothing to confirm or deny any of it. He simply kept showing up. Some Tuesdays he drank coffee on the porch and listened to Ruthie describe cloud shapes over Missionary Ridge. Some Tuesdays he repaired tack in the shed while Clara pretended not to watch his hands. Some Tuesdays he said only a dozen sentences in 2 hours and left her with enough to think about for a week. Curiosity, when it is fed by steadiness, grows teeth more slowly than infatuation. But it bites deeper. The confession came beside the creek on August 7th, after a calf had broken through a stretch of shared fence and Clara, hearing Gideon raise a hateful racket, had gone running with her skirts gathered. Elias was already in the shallows below the cottonwoods, boots soaked, one hand on the frightened animal's jaw, talking low until it stilled. Together they got the calf through the gap and braced the loose rails with a pole. The creek smelled of cold stone and willow bark. The mountains stood blue in the distance, almost too clear to bear. Clara thanked him more sharply than gratitude requires, and he heard the fear behind it. "You think if you need a thing twice," he said, "it will start owning you." She opened her mouth to deny it and found no honest words. So he gave her honesty instead. Mateo was 19, he said. January of '85. A drift storm above Rico. He had gone after a stray team because Elias had told him to wait until morning. By sundown he was still not back. We found him 2 days later, half a mile from the cabin and close enough to home to make it worse. After that, Elias said, he got particular about leaving people with what they needed before dark. Not because it brought anyone back. Because some losses teach a man to hate unfinished care. Clara looked at him then as if the valley had shifted. Grief does not leave. It just learns the new floorboards. The story settled between them without spectacle. They walked the repaired calf back to pasture and talked instead about water rights and how many more weeks before the early peaches would need picking. Yet something in the air had gone from guarded to known. That evening Clara stood at the east kitchen window he had fixed and watched the shelf catch the last of the light. He had built it with the matter-of-factness of a man who assumed tomorrow belonged in the room. She put her palm on the wood and thought of Mateo in a snowfield, of Daniel in runoff water, and of Elias cutting a ditch in cold mud without stopping to explain himself. Some people arrive by talking. Others arrive by remaining useful after the world has gone inconvenient. Only one kind tends to stay. Nathaniel Greeley made his strongest move on August 15th. He asked Clara to meet him in the bank's back office and showed, with calm fingers and no falsity, that a late frost or rail delay could cut the orchard too close to the due date for comfort. The bank might extend the note to January if additional collateral were offered. Clara had none. Then he said, very gently, that a wife's obligations and a husband's assets were often read together by institutions. He could give her certainty, he said, a tidy house in town, freedom from wagon axles and ditch boards, freedom from deciding whether a woman kept what her dead husband left her. It was not an ugly offer. That was the trouble. 2 evenings later Elias found her in the packing shed, sitting before Daniel Mercer's old seed chest with the split cedar lid across her knees. She had meant to mend it herself and had instead spent an hour tracing the knife-cut initials on the inside plank. Elias asked permission before touching the wood. He planed the break clean, set a brace underneath, and fastened the lid with small brass screws from his own pocket. When he was finished, he sanded the edge smooth enough that Clara's fingertips no longer caught where the split had been. He did not cover Daniel's initials. He built around them. Clara had to turn away then because he had just shown her, more clearly than any declaration could have, that being chosen did not require the erasure of the dead. The past does not have to be removed to make room for the future. It only has to be handled gently. By the last week of August, even Ruthie stopped asking questions and started making predictions. She said Clara would choose wrong if she waited until fear grew respectable enough to look like prudence. Adeline Pike said the same thing in older words. Tomas Vega remarked that most people did not ruin their lives through passion. They ruined them through hesitation with a good explanation attached. Clara listened and kept on calculating as though arithmetic might one day decide what courage could not. When Nathaniel asked whether he might escort her to the Harvest Social on September 22nd, she did not say yes. She also did not say no. Elias heard the uncertainty by morning. His next Tuesday visit was shorter than the others, and he left before coffee had cooled. That was when Clara understood the danger of quiet men. Their hurt does not announce itself. It merely removes a warmth you had already started relying on. September burned the valley gold. Cottonwoods thickened with yellow along the river. Dust rose from the county road and hung in the evenings as if the day were reluctant to settle. Clara picked peaches with Ruthie and 3 hired women from Bayfield, packed crates for the Friday freight, and tried not to count how many small silences had opened between herself and Elias over the past 2 weeks. He still came when there was work plainly needing him. He did not linger. She told herself this was what she wanted. Less confusion, more dignity. No girlhood foolishness attached to a man with strong hands and a dangerous habit of making space brighter. Yet her body betrayed her. Each Tuesday, her ear lifted toward the road before her mind consented. Each time he left early, the house felt not merely quiet but reduced. At supper on September 14th, Ruthie set down her spoon and said, "If you let good things go because they scare you, then the leaving is on you." Clara told her 17 was too young for wisdom. Ruthie said maybe, but not too young for eyesight. The true break came 4 days later at the far west fence where Clara's orchard met the rise toward Sun Bench. Elias had brought tools to replace a brace post before autumn winds made worse of it. Clara meant only to hand him staples. Instead, she found every deferred word gathering in her throat until silence itself became a kind of lie. When he finally straightened, sweat darkening the band of his hat, the evening had begun to lean west. Clara heard herself say it before she had chosen it. "Men always leave me by sundown." This time the line sounded like a defense polished by years of use. Elias rested both hands on the fence rail and looked directly at her. "I have been leaving because you looked like you needed room more than you needed me near," he said. But I am tired of pretending distance is kindness when it only makes cowards of us. He glanced toward the slope above them where his pasture held the late light. I own the sun here, he said. If you mean whether I intend to ride off when a thing becomes inconvenient, then no. If you mean whether I will ask to stay where my work and my heart have both already gone, then yes. Two futures rarely meet in a parlor. They meet at the fence. Clara gripped the top rail so hard her knuckles paled. She wanted, in one terrible instant, to step across the line and let relief do the choosing for her. Instead, she reached for the oldest fear available. Nathaniel can offer certainty, she said. A bank extension. A house in town. He can offer a life that doesn't depend on frost and luck and cattle prices. Elias nodded once, as though conceding the truth had cost him nothing when in fact it had cost plenty. He said, and I can offer weather, work, and the fact that I have never once stood on your land without trying to leave it sounder than I found it. He paused, then added the one line of pushback he had likely been holding for weeks. If you choose him because you want him, Clara. Not because fear has learned to dress itself as wisdom. She looked away then, toward the rose Daniel had planted and the house whose east window Elias had changed and the packing shed where Daniel's initials still sat untouched in newly mended cedar. Tears rose, not dramatic, simply present. She said she did not know how to stop waiting for loss. Elias answered quietly, you stop by letting someone build tomorrow in front of you and then believing what you saw. He left her there at dusk, because declarations do not end a person's terror merely by being sincere. For 2 days Clara moved through the harvest as though her body had become a workplace for decision. Friday's shipment went out on schedule. Saturday brought the harvest social in Durango, lanterns strung across the livery yard, fiddles on the hotel porch, pies set beneath netting, and half the county arranged in informal witness around matters no one would admit they had come to observe. Nathaniel arrived in a dark frock coat and offered Clara his arm with unblemished courtesy. She took it because refusing in public would have been a cruelty he had not earned. Adeline Pike saw everything. Tomas Vega saw the rest. Ruthie, in her sky-blue dress and impatient heart, nearly vibrated with the strain of silence. Elias came late, after tying his horse at the outer rail, wearing a clean blue shirt beneath his vest and the grave expression of a man who had decided not to hide even if he lost. No one said his name when he entered the yard, but attention moved toward him the way grass leans before weather. Nathaniel chose that moment to force what private caution had failed to secure. He asked Clara, within easy hearing of half the yard, whether she had considered his offer enough to give him an answer before the month was gone. The question was polite. It was also a strategy. Before Clara could speak, Elias crossed the space between them and said that if the matter was the note, then the figures should be said clean. The West Hay Meadow on Sunbench was clear title, 72 acres with water access, and he would put it against Mrs. Mercer's debt Monday morning if she wished the extension and if the bank wanted collateral instead of a husband. A murmur moved through the yard. Nathaniel's face changed into the look of a man whose reasonable path had just become expensive. You would stake half your winter feed on sentiment, he said, and there was real friction in it at last. Elias answered, no, on what I have seen her build with less help than most men could stand. For one difficult second Nathaniel did not yield. He looked at Clara with a steadiness that, had he chosen otherwise, might have become cruelty. Instead it became dignity under strain. I am not ashamed of offering safety, he said. The world punishes women for lacking it. Clara stepped toward him then, because kindness owed its own courage. You should not be ashamed, she said. But I cannot marry a fear, even a sensible one. Nathaniel held her gaze, and the cost of losing showed plainly enough to honor him. Then he exhaled, the fight leaving without bitterness. Fair is fair, he said softly. I hope he deserves the risk. Tomas Vega, from near the pie table, muttered that risk was often the only honest dowry. Nathaniel almost smiled at that. He tipped his hat to Clara, then to Elias, and walked away through the lantern light with exactly the amount of grace the moment required. Even gentle rivals bruise when they lose. It does not make them villains. The yard exhaled after him. Music from the porch found the air again. Clara turned to Elias with all the watching faces of Durango falling strangely out of focus. Instead of giving a speech, she reached for his work-rough hand and said, so quietly that only the nearest people heard it, if you stake your meadow for my orchard, then you had better quit standing at the fence and come through the gate. Relief moved over his face like a man setting down a load he had carried farther than anyone knew. He did not kiss her there. That would have been for the crowd. He only bowed his head once and said he had been waiting on that gate since April. Ruthie made a sound halfway between laughter and tears. Clara and Elias walked the first dance together under lantern light while the valley cooled and the mountains darkened. A future becomes real the moment someone begins paying for it with what they cannot easily replace. Monday morning they rode into town side by side. Not yet married, not yet merged in law, but joined enough in purpose that people on Main Avenue turned openly to watch. Elias laid the deed abstract for the West Meadow on Nathaniel Greeley's desk without flourish. Nathaniel examined it, asked the necessary questions, and drafted the extension to January 15, 1889. At a rate Clara could meet if the late crop sold as expected. He did the work flawlessly. When he slid the paper across, he said to Clara that one day she ought to tell her grandchildren the bank once behaved nobly under pressure, because such legends should be preserved. Clara smiled and promised the line might survive if improved in the retelling. Outside, the September air smelled of horses, coal smoke, and apples from a cart on the corner. Elias asked whether she regretted anything. She answered by asking what he planned to do first on land that now partly belonged to her future. He said he planned to move the cedar posts from her shed to the west boundary and build a gate wide enough for 2 wagons, because separate chores were wasting daylight. She said that sounded less like romance than carpentry. He said in his experience the difference was smaller than people believed. They were married on November 3rd under a cold bright sky, with the first hard frost silvering the orchard grass and Ruthie insisting on blue ribbon at Clara's throat because grief and joy were both entitled to color. The ceremony took place on the porch between the house Elias had lightened and the yard they had both spent months repairing in pieces. Adeline Pike cried openly. Tomas Vega stood witness. Nathaniel Greeley sent a set of account books bound in calfskin and a note that made Clara laugh longer than the gift required. Through November and into December, Elias and Clara practiced the ordinary astonishments of a joined life. He widened the gate at the west fence. She taught him that Gideon would only accept harness from the left side. He roofed the chicken run before the first snow. On the shortest days, when sundown came mean and early, Clara sometimes called that men always left her by sundown. Then he would turn from whatever post or hinge held him and answer, "I own the sun here," with the settled seriousness of a vow that had finally learned its proper shape. By April of 1889 the peach trees were in bloom again, pale pink against a sky so clean it seemed washed overnight in snowmelt. The mortgage note, still not easy, had become manageable. The widened west gate stood where a boundary used to insist on itself. Calves bawled on sun bench. Ruthie talked of teacher training in Pueblo and blushed when Tomas Vega's younger cousin came too often for apples. Clara kneaded bread in the kitchen one morning with the east window bright across her hands and heard Elias outside splitting kindling for no reason except that he liked the pile kept ahead of need. She stepped onto the porch, flour on her wrists, and found him in the yard with spring light all around him and an armful of wood against his chest. He looked up as if her presence were the expected continuation of the day. "Men always leave me by sundown," she said. And this time the line belonged not to fear but to memory made harmless. Elias smiled, shifted the wood higher, and answered, "I own the sun here." Then he came inside before the light had even thought of leaving, set the wood by the stove, and touched her shoulder in passing as if home were the simplest fact in the world. That is how some promises prove themselves. Not in the saying, in the staying. And maybe that is the part worth carrying into your own life when the story is over. Not the grand confession, though those have their place. Not even the public choosing, though courage sometimes needs witnesses. The truer measure is smaller and harder to counterfeit. Who notices what is broken without being asked? Who builds for your tomorrow as if they expect to share it? Who can stand beside what you lost without trying to compete with it? Clara learned that love did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it came in the shape of a repaired ditch, a straightened window, a seed chest mended around an old set of initials. Sometimes it looked like a person learning the exact hour your fear usually spoke and arriving before it. Sometimes it meant offering not rescue, but partnership, and then proving that promise on weekdays when no one was watching. Sometimes it waited at a fence line until fear stopped mistaking itself for wisdom. If you have known loss, then you know how tempting it is to call caution maturity and retreat discernment. But a careful heart still deserves a faithful future. Thank you for riding through this story with me. If it stayed with you, I hope it reminded you that quiet devotion is still devotion, and that some of the best promises a person will ever hear are built before they are spoken. I hope it also reminded you that worthy love often sounds plain while it is being built, and only later reveals how brave it was. Until next time, keep riding. And if you think a fence line can only hold one vow, wait until you hear what happened when a ranch cook whispered, "Men never stay past first snow," and the one-armed drover answered, "Then I'll winter here."